Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm Nancy Lee, I'm Director of the Sustainable Development Finance Program. I'm really delighted to see all of you, and I really look forward to this particular conversation. 32 years ago, the World Bank published the East Asian Miracle Study. And we are fortunate to have one of its co-authors today, Nancy Birdsall, who is also our founding president. It was a groundbreaking exploration of East Asian economies, which had achieved decades of rapid growth using strategies that departed from the orthodoxy of the day. I remember well the impact that it had, perhaps more than any other single World Bank report. It sparked a lot of debate among economists, steeped in skepticism about selective government intervention, picking winners and losers, as the phrase went. Much has changed since then, including, of course, as we all know, in the last month. I'm sure you're all familiar with the stylized facts, but let me just go through them very briefly. Globally, tariff barriers were already low in the 90s, but they fell further. Growth in international trade was critical in driving poverty reduction and also convergence in income levels, or some partial convergence in global income levels across countries. But support for the open trading system has been battered, especially in countries where workers in trade-affected sectors face losses in jobs and real income. That's not, of course, the whole story. Technological change in manufacturing in particular, including AI, is driving down the manufacturing share of employment across countries, including in China. And also the rapid growth in China's global trade share has been accompanied by rising dissatisfaction with the system's capacity to discipline its deployment of non-tariff barriers and subsidies. Some worry that services and services exports cannot replace manufacturers as the driver of sustained high growth. So we have some good news, though, however, on the poverty reduction side, which is that new studies at the household level suggest that greater than anticipated potential for reducing poverty while staying in agriculture, at least extreme poverty. But broadly, we're at a moment where we're seeing gaps between 20th century developing country growth models and 21st century realities, and certainly given developments in US trade policy, developing countries can no longer rely on a global open trading system or on the sectoral opportunities of the 20th century. As the world's two largest economies are locked in highly costly trade disputes, and a global slowdown is forecast, more than ever, poor countries urgently need evidence-based advice on how to boost and sustain growth. So hence the conversation we're organizing today. Our aim here is to move beyond orthodoxy, either from the left or the right, and discuss evidence useful to countries that are, after all, without a lot of fiscal space or political space to spend a lot of time experimenting, and are now confronting major upheavals in supply chains. We should, of course, remember, as they say, that every crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and these upheavals in supply chains do create opportunities, or can create opportunities for some countries. So we are fortunate to have Nancy here today to launch our discussion with reflections on what the East Asian Miracle Study actually found and did not find, and what's relevant for today. And Nancy's remarks will be followed by a conversation with a panel of very distinguished economists. So let me invite Nancy now to the podium.
Thank you very much, Nancy. It's a pleasure for me to have this podium again for a few minutes. It's been a while, actually. It is certainly an apt moment to think about industrial policy, which I think is the point of the discussion with our panelists today. Since we've had the Biden administration doing a form of industrial policy with its subsidies for green technology and so on, and then, of course, with Trump, something that we might call, I don't know, industrial policy. But that's the question that I want to address indirectly today about this report on the East Asian miracle, more than 30 years ago, as Nancy said, which has often been, to this report has often been attributed industrial policy that worked in at least some countries of East Asia. It was published in 1993 at the heart of the neoliberal moment, in a way, when Clinton, we worked on it in 1992. So Bill Clinton was elected in November of 1992, which captured a lot about an era that we could have called neoliberal because he was a Democrat who supported and pushed free trade, particularly with the NAFTA agreement. And of course, the Democrats, among others, have been blamed for the subsequent 30 years for some of the problems that neoliberalism created. So as Nancy Lee said, these countries in East Asia, and it's the four tigers that are known to most of you, I'm sure Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan in there too, grew at 5.5% per capita GDP for 30 years. An extraordinary story for development economists, for sure. And the book is about why. What did they do that made them so successful? I have a surprise at the end of what I say about industrial policy, since this panel is addressing certain issues around industrial policy. So wait for the surprise. So why were these countries so successful? The book is very clear on the usual, I'll call it the usual and the less usual factors. The usual factors, good macro management. And indeed, if there were other policies that pushed hard in one direction or another that became inconsistent with macroeconomic stability, boom, stopped. That was true for the HCI, heavy chemical industry push in Korea. It was also true in Japan with MITI that some of you might know about or remember. So good macro management, high accumulation, not only of physical capital, but of human capital. And this is something that cannot be stressed enough. Huge increases in primary and secondary school enrollment in particular. And not as in many other developing countries, the political push elsewhere was for higher education, for the elite, you could say. This didn't happen in East Asia. The push was for primary and secondary, and the achievement of gender equality from the get-go. So high accumulation of human capital as well as physical capital, and of course, high total factor productivity growth. That's really where the issues and the questions arise. What was the magic that created this high TFP growth for so many years? So that's the usual. The less usual, I want to make 3 points about what was less usual. The first is about agriculture. And there's a very interesting book by Joe Studwell that some of you might know who are Asia experts, How Asia Works. And he calls it gardening, what happened in the East Asian economies on agriculture. And the idea of the gardening symbol, I suppose, is the maximization of labor inputs. So family workers worked hard. But I think behind that, and more important, was that there was no loss, because agriculture was productive and increasingly productive. There was no bleeding away of foreign exchange, as in Latin America and other developing regions, for food imports. So food was taken care of within these East Asian economies. And they avoided the overvalued exchange rates, which arise because often of what Michael Lipton called urban bias, many of you may know about, which also penalize agriculture, overvalued exchange rates. I had been working on Brazil just prior to dealing with this book in the department that I headed. And boy, overvalued exchange rates at the time were a problem, not just in Latin America, but certainly in Latin America. So the whole urban bias problem was avoided. So that's the first, gardening. Second is shared growth. The book, in a good way, and I was, a proponent of this, makes a very big push for shared growth, which meant in education, there wasn't the bias toward higher education for the elites, but toward primary and secondary education. In agriculture, there wasn't the bias toward keeping urban consumers happy. So, they avoided all these things that created problems and undermined shared growth. And housing in Hong Kong is famous for millions of people. Some of it was fear of China and fear of communism, which we can maybe reproduce in a different way now. I don't know. So everything was done in a way that led to highly shared growth. Most important probably in agriculture for shared growth was land reform in Taiwan and Korea, which provided a model and made a big difference. But the third point, besides agriculture and shared growth, is the export push. And that is what, in my view, looking back at this report, distinguished the East Asian miracle economies at the time. Was that industrial policy? I don't know. I don't know how to think about that. It's not what we think of with industrial policy. But the export push was very important, and they did it in very different ways. They did it in very interesting ways. For example, they had some financial repression. Deposit rates were kept low, and the government used access to credit as a kind of reward in a contest among companies. Those who could show they had order forms for exports got subsidized credit. So it was a contest with a performance criterion that was very important. And there's a lot more to the export push. I don't want to go too far. It's, for economists, lots of stuff. I guess we're guaranteed access, for example, to critical imports for manufacturing. What's the big but around the export push in the book, which is interesting? There's a very clear message that the export push and other factors, that were not super market friendly, were just not transferable to other countries and other regions. And I pulled out some quotes. It's so great. Let's see. Where did I put them? Maybe not here, Dan. Oh, here we go. The institutional demands are not compatible with other developing countries where the fundamentals are not in place. The use of contests in Japan and Korea required competent and insulated civil servants. The prerequisites for success were so rigorous that policymakers seeking to follow similar paths in other developing economies have often met with failure. The ability of economic technocrats to formulate and implement policies with a minimum of lobbying for special favors from politicians and interest groups is critical. So basically, in this report, the authors said, this was great, things like the export push, but you better not try it if you don't have the insulated civil service setup that is typical of these, that was typical of these East Asian economies. Some of these things that worked in the Tigers also worked in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, the other 3 East Asian economies, but not so much and not as clearly, et cetera. So that was the big but. Now, the bottom line, as I read it in this book, which I didn't really understand until I looked back after 30 years, comes near the end where the authors say industrial policy didn't work. Or no, that's the wrong way to put it. There's no sign that there was industrial policy if you define industrial policy as affecting the sectoral, what's the right way to say it, allocation of productivity or production across industries. The key industries that were successful in the East Asian economies were, surprise, surprise, textiles and apparel. That's where the highest total factor productivity growth came. So I was surprised by that, honestly. I mean, I can't take, maybe it's good, maybe it's not so good, real credit for much of what's in this book. I was the head of the department, so I made decisions about who did what and who was really in charge. And the key author, John Page, is very sick now and not available. So it's really unfortunate that he can't be here. Anyway, the other aspect of IP that I didn't mention was the deliberation councils, which maybe we'll hear more about from the other panelists. In these councils, government would get together, government bureaucrats would get together with members of the industry and have frank discussions that created, it dealt with a lot of the market imperfections of communication and cooperation, the externalities associated with lack of information. So if you put together the export push and the deliberation councils, maybe some people would call that industrial policy, but the fact is the book is very clear that there was no effect on the sectoral composition of GDP growth. So what about the surprise? I guess that's part of the surprise. Where was industrial policy, you know, in the traditional sense of the word? All the changes that were brought about, including through the export push, are deigned in the book as market conforming. So that leaves us with deliberation councils and the export push as maybe industrial policy that didn't actually work to change sectoral composition. So that's something maybe some of the other panelists will want to comment on. But it was a surprise to me because I thought, when I started looking back at the East Asian Miracle book and the experience of those countries, that there would be lessons around the discussion today of industrial policy. So we can't really look to the book for it. We will look to the panelists for lessons about industrial policy. One other point that's very important that is pretty clear in the book, which, you know, maybe it seemed clear to me because I like it, because I favor it, being a human capital sort of person on what works in economics for making people happier and richer at the same time. And that's improving human capital. But it's very clear that the growth was the subject, or the combination of two things. One, exports, which help economies adopt and master international best practice. There's nothing new about this idea. Given imperfect knowledge markets, especially in technology, exports give you access, by doing exports well, gives you access to best practice at the international level. And that went on for all these decades. Second is you combine that with higher labor force skills. It's an interaction that occurs. When you have enough people in the workforce, particularly, say, in manufacturing, with secondary education. And this is a huge point also made by Claudia Golden and Lawrence Katz in their book on what happened in the US and why was the US so successful in the 20th century, and how they emphasized that it was all about education, and particularly high school education. And the success, as they measure it, is this combination of rapid total factor productivity growth and reduction of any inequality. It's the same concept again, shared growth around human capabilities. Higher labor force skills interact to facilitate the acquisition and mastery of technology with attendant spillovers. So it's called technological learning. It was absolutely fundamental, more fundamental than what we think might have been something about industrial policy around BT and the failed heavy chemical industry push in Korea. Oh, that's very interesting in itself. They saw that it wasn't working, and they withdrew. So anything that you might call industrial policy that threatened macroeconomic stability, it was stopped. So we are now in the age of premature deindustrialization, as Nancy implied. I think it's worth hearing from the panelists. What does that tell us about what can be done? Obviously, on the services side, services exports, it's hard. It's hard to contemplate. So I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say about how to make that work. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage, and I can introduce them, and we can start our conversation. And please sit anywhere. That's fine. Well, that was, as I say, that was a really interesting start, because you notice the words picking winners and losers did not pass Nancy's lips. She talked about productive agriculture, she talked about investments in education, and she talks about competition for support for productive exports as opposed to deciding what sectors to focus on. So very much bursting the myth that East Asian Miracle was all about picking particular export sectors. So I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished set of panelists who have really different, but I think complementary perspectives on this whole issue. We have Arvind Subramanian, who's a distinguished non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, and he was former chief economic advisor to the government of India. We have Laura Carvalho, who's global director for economic and climate prosperity at the Open Society Foundations. We have Ottaviano Canudo, who's senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. And we have Tristan Reed, who's economist for the Development Research Group at the World Bank. So I'm going to pose a few questions, but I I'd be happy if, interspersed in your answers, if you have any reactions to what Nancy said, please sprinkle your comments. So let's start with you, Arvin. You've written about the success stories of the early Modi administration on providing basic public services, but noted less success in terms of changing the investment climate. And you also written about this question of manufacturers versus services and services export as a driver of growth. So 2 questions for you, and it really follows on what Nancy was saying. Should we actually be talking about industrial policy? Should we be more agnostic about the sectoral approach, as we now know the East Asian Miracle Study actually was, and talk about more supporting high productivity, export-oriented activities? And then I can't resist asking you, given the upheaval in global supply chains, this is a moment of opportunity perhaps for India, and what policies would you suggest they jump on right now to take advantage of that opportunity?
Thanks, Nancy. And thanks, the other Nancy, for a wonderful introduction. So I just want to step back before coming to India. I just want to step back and say that I think the reason we are kind of going back to the drawing board and saying, what should development strategy be, right? I don't think it's because of free market versus industrial policy, government intervention. That's a tired, stale, uninteresting debate, okay? And I'll say why. That's not why, that's uninteresting, and that's not why I think we're having this fundamental reassessment. I think we're having this fundamental reassessment at this stage because the only tried and successful model of durable and inclusive growth that Nancy has just outlined so wonderfully is the sense that that export-led manufacturing growth model is no longer available today for 2 reasons. One, as your last point, that the world is deglobalizing, so the exporting opportunities are shrinking. So that's no longer an option, and that's why more and more people are now saying, should countries turn inward? And the second reason, of course, is that even if those exporting opportunities were available, the employment bang for the buck is now going to be much less because of the new technologies, AI, robotics, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the context in which we are reassessing development strategy, not because, governments versus markets, that's completely uninteresting. So I want to revisit, therefore, it links to your question. And I think we need to understand why that model was so successful, apart from just building on what Nancy said. It was successful because it required exporting, which meant that both demand was infinite and you had to be competitive because you're exporting. It was above all successful because it was aligned with what was the abundant labor in the country, the comparative advantage of country, so you got inclusive growth. And then the point that Danny makes very well was that there was something about manufacturing which was a natural escalator for success because you got unconditional convergence in manufacturing. So once you got into the manufacturing ladder, over time, organically, productivity rose very rapidly, and at every stage, your skill endowment could be aligned with technological progress. So that's what made manufacturing so successful. So now, there are now 2 alternative strategies on offer. One is associated with Rohit Lamba and Raghu, where they say, based on the India model, that services should be emphasized. To me, that's a complete non-starter because it is a recipe for inequality rather than inclusiveness, because it's based on high-skilled services. So it has the virtue of being tradable and exportable, so you get some of the benefits of exporting manufacturing. But in terms of the inclusiveness, it's a kind of fatally limited, because you're going to benefit directly 3, 4, generously 5% of your labor force. So it's not a model for inclusive growth. The alternative strategy that Danny has put forward recently, is that countries should focus on non-tradable services. Because the virtue of non-tradable services is that it can be inclusive, because by definition services are a big part of the economy. And there, I think my problem with that is people forget that non-tradable services, and this is the paper I wrote for CGD, is that non-tradable services themselves can either be high skill, telecommunications, finance, etc. are very high skilled, they're non-tradable services, or they could be low skilled. But the problem that Danny identifies, that a technology is going to make it labor replacing, applies as much to non-tradable services. And second, low-skill non-tradable services. And we have this Baumol effect looming over everything, is that unskilled non-tradable services are not going to be either high productive or rapidly growing in productivity. So that benefit of manufacturing being an escalator is not available. So my pitch to all of you is that there is still legs in the old model. So I want to make 3 or 4 points about that. One, remember that now we want that manufacturing model, etc., to apply to the low and middle income countries. The NICs have graduated, China is graduating. So even if the world is deglobalizing, all the space that can be vacated by China and this is available for the low and middle income countries to occupy. And even if it's going to be less employment intensive, the job opportunities are a lot. Let me give you some numbers. So the low and medium skill exports market's about $6 trillion, right? Let's say, developing countries can get half of it, or even less maybe. And then you add on to the fact that all these newly developing countries like China, etc., themselves open their markets. You could get something like $3 trillion worth of exports, something like that. And my calculation, Amrit and our calculation is that it could sustain inclusive growth for about 500 million people in the world. So it is because remember, this is the only tried and tested model for inclusive and durable growth. There is still scope for that for the countries that previously didn't benefit from that. So provided the world doesn't completely collapse under these tariffs and deglobalizes, provided China and the others, if they really mean to be new anchors of the system, if they could maintain open economies, Europe could maintain another, the space that low and middle income countries could occupy to extract juice from this tried and tested model is still there. It's not going to be as as good or as rewarding as the 30, 40-year experience of the countries that Nancy spoke about. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, I think it could still make a very huge contribution. So that's why I think let's not give up on that, because let's be a little bit sober. The services model gives you dynamism but no inclusion. Danny's model gives you inclusion but limited dynamism. The old model provides dynamism and inclusion, albeit for a lesser fraction and for not as powerful as before. But that is the model we should aim towards and make sure that whatever global rules, etc., are recrafted, that part of the system is maintained. It's not a very demanding set of requirements. We need countries to, essentially what we need is that all the space occupied by the rich middle-income countries to be vacated for the low and middle-income countries, and there is still leg in this model. We should still pursue that.
That's great, Arvind. But as you say, the success of the trajectory that you're advocating is still very much dependent on an open trading system, and having countries the more developing countries open their markets so that we can see these shifts in market share and manufacturers' export markets.
And therefore,
Comes back to the trading system.
And then you can have this tired, I really think it's a tired debate, how they do it, industrial policy, what this, that, and the other, that's going to be country specific, et cetera. But I think that's not something that you can easily generalize about, or in fact, it's something that countries have to figure out themselves based on their state capacity. It's the warning that Nancy ended with, for example, don't think that everyone can do this. You have to do it on your own. But that's a less interesting question in my view.
Excellent. Okay, Lara, I wanted to turn to you next. In July 2024, you called out what you called the dead hand of neoliberalism, which I thought was just a fabulous phrase, arguing that market-based approaches can't really address these global issues that require collective action. And you observe that the developing world is hamstrung by the old rules. And of course, we see the rich world dramatically departing from the rules in their own policy. And we've also seen large corporations who had been committed to net zero commitments, easing off those commitments pretty rapidly as the political winds change. So we can't expect the private sector to ride to the rescue, at least for these global challenges. So you call for state-led models that link green strategies with more equal development. So give us some sort of examples of what a good state-led model looks like and what countries that you see on the landscape are deploying these models.
Okay, so let me also take a step back and start with, of course, I think one lesson from the report is that maybe we can take is that there's no one-size-fits-all type of solution on this. And I think, of course, states, different levels of state capacity matter, but not only that. I think countries, large countries in Latin America, for example, with higher wages are unlikely to succeed in the type of export-led development that East Asian countries experienced, right? And that's just to mention one example. And I think in this moment, that's also true. Each country will need to find their own strategy and trajectory based on the existing tools, based on the fiscal space they have, based on the natural resources they have and the availability of critical minerals, for example, or other pieces that are relevant in the current green supply chains. But still, I would argue that industrial policy, or let's call it development strategies, as we were mentioning, need to be well coordinated by the state if they are to deliver on the goal, on not only the climate goals, but also the economic development goals in the short and long term. And here, I think of course, the most notable example of a country that took advantage of the climate transition to enter green tech sectors and basically dominate these sectors is China, right? And I think we haven't talked about China enough here, and I wonder how this report even saw that coming in a way, because of course China has perceived and seized all the opportunities that the climate transition offered for new sectors, for grabbing new parts of the supply chain that were not existent before. And I think that does give countries, and obviously the fact that China is already there makes it harder for others to grab pieces of that supply chain, but it still gives some perspective on what is possible. I think following China, we did see the rich countries, the US most notably with the Inflation Reduction Act, but also Europe and the UK more and more now, understanding that the climate transition can be a huge opportunity for transforming the economy and delivering on other goals, right? These green, let's call it the new generation of industrial policies, which are basically green industrial policies, if you want, they're still very new, and I think it's very hard to take many lessons. The US has abandoned its strategy, which makes it even harder for us to look at it. But still, I think countries are in the South, developing countries are starting to perceive the climate transition as an opportunity for them too. And I think we have a few examples of policies that we're still looking for the results and wanting, of course, we were waiting for the results before making any assessments, but we have Mexico now with Plan Mexico that is looking at both clean tech, pharmaceuticals, and other investing a lot in research and development infrastructure around these sectors and combining climate and development goals. We have Brazil with the Ecological Transformation Plan and the New Industry Brazil Plan. So 2 countries in Latin America which are focused on those complementarities. In Brazil, for example, there is what we're calling power shoring, right? The fact that it has clean energy and how it can attract manufacturing based on that, but also new sectors that are being targeted, such as sustainable aviation fuels, biofertilizers, and so here a sectoral approach is back, of course in connection with existing capabilities and resources. Indonesia, just to pick another example of a country that is actually taking advantage of the current policy space that the kind of the damage of the WTO and the fact that the appalling body of the WTO isn't functioning, actually created some space for Indonesia to establish a ban on nickel exports that, I mean, I think there's trade-offs in this strategy, but has allowed the country to upgrade and move up the value chain of nickel and actually attract the Chinese companies to process nickel and actually and the export value of this supply chain has increased tremendously. There are labor standards and other problems that we could discuss here, but still it's a clear example of a country that is taking advantage of the current policy space to do industrial policy and enter more value-added sectors. So the opportunities are there. The fact that the US is abandoning this strategy even opens up more pieces of the supply chain for other countries. So let's look at that as, of course, for the US itself, it doesn't look like the current strategy will yield much results in terms of industrialization, if that's the goal. I think the experience of Latin American import substitution, Otaviano is here. We can see the pros and cons with that. Most people think it's failed, but definitely even the defenders of the import substitution strategy in Latin America would not see the US current policies as very promising, given how rudimentary the tariff system is and how little differentiation it makes. But still, the fact that the US is actually abandoning its strategy opens up, I think, more room. But then what I will leave for the next part of the discussion is how can cooperation between countries play a different role? Because even though there are opportunities for national strategies, I tend to see the cooperation between different countries regionally, but not only, as more key, especially in this moment, to advance industrial policy goals. And I think there are examples already that we see in this defense, I would say more defensive examples that are, now Japan, Korea, and China are creating cooperation agreements to deal with the US tariffs, for example. But I think there is much more promising perspectives if developing countries start to cooperate around supply chains, around integrating markets, and advancing industrial policy tools in a more collective way. And if the rules-based system also guaranteed that not only the middle powers that like Indonesia can take advantage of the policy space, but instead how can we create a rules-based system that gives room for poorer countries to develop and implement their own tools, as well as create more than a zero-sum game, which I think is the challenge we have now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So it's really a very different model from either the East Asian Miracle model and the model that Arvind was talking about, because it's using the potential for green inclusive growth as the organizing principle for setting policy and for actually encouraging certain value chains in that area. So that actually is a good segue to Ottaviano, who recently wrote a paper about the spillover effects of countries' subsidies, particularly when the subsidies are deployed in such a way that the country then dominates production in a certain sector, like solar panels in China, for example.
Right.
And that sort of relates to Laura's point about China's role in all of this, which so talk a little bit about these cross-border spillover effects. Of course, to the extent that China is lowering the cost of energy, green energy transitions, it is actually subsidizing the green transition in other countries as well as reducing emissions. So in that sense, it has positive spillover effects as well as these negative effects. And we also have the question of if there is any consensus left for rich countries to help finance these green energy transitions, which is it better to do it, as you propose, through earmarking some of these subsidies for transfers to countries to compensate, or is it better to do it by emissions taxes, as we just saw in the International Maritime Organization? So tell us how you think about all of this.
It's a real pleasure to be back here with you all, Nancy. And I will start with a very brief ego trip, okay? The affection that I have for this work, because my PhD thesis that I defended at the University of Campinas in 1901 was a comparison between Brazil and South Korea. It was clear at the time how apparently they were both following a similar path in terms of heavy and chemical industrialization, in terms of aggregate figures and so on. But clearly the performance of South Korea had started to shine, and Brazil had crossed a full decade of stagnation and so on. And so in my thesis highlighted the difference associated with what was later on, and I was so happy when this revolutionary work done by you guys, set out, changed the benchmark. In the case of my thesis, I associated the difference between Brazil and South Korea to the structure of microeconomic incentives that accompanied in both cases. Korea, in a nutshell, had a sort of helping the winners and hurting the losers. That's how the structure of chaebol came about as an outcome of that process. Whereas in Brazil, you had helping the winners and saving the losers. And the structure of microeconomics incentives explains a lot why the investment of the chaebols, what would become chaebols in South Korea, highlighted a lot the learning, the mastering of technology, because they knew that it was the only way to get where they got. It was not the case in Brazil. And this is still relevant because, as some recent reports by the World Bank and the IDB on the lack of competition in Latin America because of the kind of policies, and that's the case of Brazil, ends up hurting the destructive incentives of, so this is still a very hot issue. See, look at the Chinese. In China, it's not only the sort of wild capitalism that you have in the relationship between capital and labor. There in China, even the state-owned companies, they compete among themselves. Competition is a key dimension that has to be highlighted in any discussion on this. Second point that I'd like to make, we know that tariffs are no equivalent to subsidies. And when we produced it was for the T20, the grouping of think tanks for the G20, to make proposals to the ministers and so on. You know the drill. Next year is going to be here, right? Assuming that it exists, right? And so at the time when we prepared the note, May and some colleagues from the Policy Center, and also to distinguished Brazilian trade economist Renato Bauman and Sandra Rios, we were, at the time, the reality of the fact that subsidies have returned, or they have come as a strong, after the kind of shocks that we had since the pandemic and so on, now you have the trade-off between efficiency and let's say stability vis-a-vis shocks and so on, and geopolitics and security and so on. So that's a matter of fact. You cannot deny. But at the same time, we highlighted how from the standpoint of individual countries, despite acknowledgement of potential positive aspects coming from the spillovers and so on, but the fact of the matter that you have a war of subsidies, and the objectives are not necessarily they do not necessarily conflate with the externalities. Look, IRA, fully understandable from the standpoint of security, if you want, from the standpoint of guaranteeing the efficiency of the clean energy production in the U.S., but at the end of the day, there was a cost in terms of not using as much as it could the advance that China has already created. So you do have a potential conflict between national objectives and, let's say, overall externality costs. One should keep this in mind. So I acknowledge, obviously, that any push forward a different frontier in terms of technology of the clean energy industry coming from IRA is commendable, and it will benefit everyone and so on. But first, there is a cost of replicating efforts, and second, it's when it comes to having local production, the developing countries face a humongous task because of the war of subsidies. We went up, we mapped it out, for instance, using the JTAP database search in subsidies case from 760 cases in 2009 to over 3,000 by 2021. It's true that green subsidies accounted for 28% of the total. But the fact of the matter is that the war of subsidies, given the limited fiscal capacity of emerging markets and developing economies, isn't unfair in the sense that that's the point that we highlighted. And then we tried to be creative in highlighting the ways by which this could be partially compensated. And then we explored in the note hypotheses such as some sort of a negotiation of clear limits for the trade distorting policies. Of course, we were assuming that a multilateral framework like the WTO or the G20 itself would be in place. But in principle, some limits could be negotiated to the trade distorting policies. priority to be given to green subsidies because that's a case in which the positive externalities are obvious and so on. And data transparency. It comes to mind how we are in dire need of having work like the one done by the Global Trade Alert. I'm a fan. I'm not the only one. The IMF has also joined, called in. And also by the new Industrial Policy Observatory as well, the NIPO, because they can provide, let's say, database to track and monitor subsidies. So in principle, to classify subsidies, whether harmful in trade distorting, I'm not even talking about tariffs, and the climate-related and exempt from limits, for instance, subsidies, if some kind of, and as a compensation mechanism, the trade liberalization for affected economies, for instance, that's something that can happen, and contributions to international funds supporting green technology adoption in emerging markets and developing economies, and to have some sort of platform for dispute resolution. And finally, Laura brought in a quite important aspect on the geopolitics, on industrial policies and geopolitics of critical minerals. It's a different word relative to the one that we have been over the last. And the game is getting tougher. Clearly, there has been a change with Mr. Trump, which is the following. No one here has to be a specialist to understand that the two, let's say, technology races between the US and China at this moment, clean energy and semiconductors and AI and so on, they have at the base the issue of the access to critical minerals. It's fundamental. People look at the beauty of AI and clean energy, but there is the thing there. The Chinese have been strategic in that regard. They have been mapping out critical minerals all over the world. They have made investments in infrastructure and treaties and so on to guarantee their access. They have concentrated, they concentrate nowadays the bulk of the world capacity of treating the, working on the minerals. And to some extent, US and Europe have been laggard in that regard. For good or bad, Mr. Trump seems to, to have put this into the core of this. That's what explained, suddenly the attempt to tie the support to Ukraine to access to critical minerals there. The story about Greenland, it's all about it. And whereas Laura is right in pointing out that there is a scope for adding value on the source of critical minerals, not only in Latin America, but in Africa and so on. Even the DRC is now there calling, Americans, aren't you interested in coming here? Instead of Wagner. So this is the configuration of what we're talking about today has changed dramatically from the times of fossil fuel-based production of energy to this new world in which critical minerals replace fossil fuels. Thank you.
Very good. I mean, what you're saying really, and we'll come back to this in a minute, raises two sets of questions. One is how do the rules need to change to sort of discipline these subsidies, but also permit the positive spillovers? And then the second question really is, what if only a part of the world follows the rules? And the part that doesn't follow them are the largest countries. So we'll come back to that in a second. But Tristan, so let's turn to countries at the opposite end of the spectrum than the Indias and the Brazils and the Chinas, the countries that have small markets, need to capture economies of scale, need to attract foreign investment that transfers the technology to increase their productivity and allows them to compete on the global market. And they don't have a lot of fiscal space for subsidies. So they need to target interventions. And having read some of your stuff, I get the sense that you answer the question, is it possible to pick winners and losers? Kind of yes.
Sort of, I say.
Yes, sort of. So tell us what your work shows in terms of how countries can assess returns and risk, and give us a few examples of the countries that have done it well.
Yeah, so let me start by sharing some new data, which is that in February in the World Bank, we did a survey of our program leads for economic policies. There's about 45 people who have their main counterparts as the ministries of planning and also finance. And we asked them, in the last year, did your client ask you for support or advice about industrial policy, which means just growing a particular sector? 80% of them said yes. There are two interesting aspects of their response. So one is that overwhelmingly, when we asked about their motivation, they said economic development, jobs, investment. One country, the Republic of Chad, said national security. One country said green, environmental goods, which was China. No one said resilience. So this message that we've heard a lot that, industrial policy is seeking, new goals and politicians have new motives, that's not what we see in the field. It may be specific to DC. The second thing is that when you ask them about the policies that they're interested in, subsidies do come up, subsidized credit, for example, grants for innovation, which maybe is a bit different than Korea. Tariffs don't come up at all. But again, overwhelmingly what they're talking about is not the type of stuff that I think you think of when you think of industrial policy, but you're thinking about regulatory reforms that are tailored to a sector, skills development, specific infrastructure. And so, part of my project at the bank right now is to try to figure out a way that we can answer that question, which sector should I look at, and then what should I do about it? But before I answer that, I want to make the point that most of the discussion of industrial policy that we've heard in the last couple of years is based on analysis of this global trade alert data set by Juhas and Lane, and then later Michele Ruta and Simon Evanet did this paper. That data set provides, I think, a very misleading picture of what's going on in developing countries, because it doesn't pick up these sort of public good interventions of infrastructure, skills, and regulation. And it also has selection issues. I mean, that data set shows that there's more industrial policy in the United States than in China, which, I think is an open question. So, what do we do in developing countries? So here's my framework. I think it's first important to say what I don't think is a good idea. So there's lots of theories that point at specific industries being better than others. So, those manufacturing, tradable services, those that are green, those that are upstream, those that are complex. All of those theories say nothing about how likely it is that that industry will take off in your own country. So I think that the starting point for anything should be, what are your endowments? What are you good at? And a way to measure that is revealed comparative advantage. Now, people often say, comparative advantage, it's a normative theory economists want us to pursue. It's not. It's a positive theory. We know that countries that are more productive in certain sectors export and produce more of those things. And if you don't target something with comparative advantage, you're fighting against it, and it's going to be harder. So what we can say is that, targeting policy towards revealed comparative advantage, that's low risk. It's going to be, maybe it'll take off, maybe it'll be successful. Medium risk is sort of similar industries, linked in the value chain. Danny Bahar, I don't know if he's here, has work, showing you can predict what countries move into based on what they do now. And then high risk would be something that I've never done before, computer chips. And so, we can look at those three categories and say, as a government, how you want to balance your risks and your approach. And we see that governments do sort of all things along these categories, and I'll give a couple examples. So in the sort of low and medium risk, there's focusing on, agriculture. So, avocados in Michoacan in Mexico. They had to set up these plant safety boards, to coordinate firms to comply with regulations so they could get into the United States market. And this is even during NAFTA, they had to talk about non-tariff measures. They had to negotiate access to each individual US state to do that. That was a huge government effort, wasn't subsidies. Bangladesh, the apparel industry there, I think a little bit of a cautionary tale. So they created up these bonded warehouses, which allowed the importers to import, textiles and zipper parts and packing materials. That was very helpful for the industry, but then the regulation was built such that other industries couldn't use those warehouses. And so that identifies one risk, that you do these interventions, but then you don't want them to be closed to new industries that come about. Okay, high risk stuff. Intel in Costa Rica moved in, and these are all foreign investors. Renault in Morocco more recently. Samsung in entering into Vietnam. All of those stories, yes, there were tax exemptions, but there was a lot of attention from the government in terms of providing serviced areas to set up your factory, skills that were going to give you this kind of engineers. And Intel actually worked with HR at Intel actually worked with universities in Costa Rica to set up an associate's degree. So all of that stuff, again, not traditional industrial policy, but I think was probably made more of a difference than the tax exemptions. The final thing I'll say, in all of those examples, the reason why the firms came to the countries involved some sort of preferential trade agreement. So Korea could get tax-free inputs into Vietnam. Costa Rica could, and Mexico could get inputs or sell to the United States. And so I think that preferential trade agreements will continue to be a big part of getting industries to take off, especially through FDI. And I guess to agree a little bit with what Arvind said, I don't know that global trade is at risk. I think trade with the United States is at risk. And that's 13% of global imports, down from 19, 20 years ago. The median country has 4% of its exports going to the United States. The risk is very concentrated in Central America, Mexico, Haiti. And other countries are continuing to do trade agreements with each other and open up borders. So I think there is room for the export-led growth going forward and targeting industries according to comparative advantage and this risk framework.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, certainly you point to a continued role for the government
Certainly.
Not necessarily subsidies, but other importance of preferential trade agreements. And I would a little bit dispute certainly trade with the United States is at risk, but I think the role of China in the global economy has been distortive in the sense that they have not really, the rules of the system have really not affected their policy choices. So I do think there's a sort of...
I'll say one thing about China, if that's okay. I mean, so there's something unfair about the global trading system, which is the home market effect. So if you have a big domestic economy, you're going to achieve economies of scale, and you're just going to be better at lots of stuff. And China is huge. So even if they didn't do subsidies, like that would be there. And so they're going to take market share. On the other hand, China's outbound FDI has been growing at about 8% CAGR for the last years. You're now seeing new industries, autos, batteries. That's actually the Belt and Road Initiative was Chinese companies looking for demand outside. And now you're seeing, particularly as returns fall in China, you're seeing outbound FDI go to certain countries. So again, I think there'll be opportunities. They may be a little different than before, but new technologies, new manufacturing is there.
Yeah. Arvind has a two-hander.
A two-hander and a question for Tristan. So just two-hander is that 2 points. One, what Tristan said at the end about trade to the U.S., not overall trade is at risk. But even there, let's be clear that when the U.S. imposes tariffs, there's a general trade contractionary effect, but there's also a trade diversion effect away from China, et cetera, which on balance might favor some of the countries. So Justin and I wrote a paper saying here that AGOA should think about giving subsidies, not just preferential trade agreement. But in a perverse way, if the U.S. increases tariffs much more for China, Vietnam than Sub-Saharan Africa, it is a preferential trade. It's preferential trade. So that's one caveat. The second thing, Tristan, is that one has to be careful about. See, one rule for development economics discussions is China is completely sui generis. There are no lessons for any other developing country based on what China did. I think, obviously, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but let's not get into that. But even for China, I think Justin's point about the scale needs to be a little bit qualified, because in the initial stages, the first 20 years, for example, China was poor and it exploited economy scale through exporting rather than the domestic market. So I think, My question for Tristan would be, all these examples, successful examples that you give, for example, which I think are very interesting. I mean, apart from the Bangladesh example, have any of them led to durable success?
I'm sorry. Go ahead and answer.
I mean, I think all the examples I listed, I mean, Mexico's largest exporter of avocados in the world, and Vietnam, I think both in Morocco and Vietnam, those were sort of first movers, and then you have other things. Vietnam is now leading cell phone exports. What I'm actually more interested in is understanding the examples of failure, which are less well documented. And so that's why I like the Bangladesh. I think, I don't know if it's a failure. I mean, it's like they worked, but then they sort of closed it off to other industries. And I'm trying to find actually more of those sorts of examples. But certainly also, many countries have FDI promotion agencies that don't attract any FDI. And, that may be for various reasons.
Okay, Ottaviano, very briefly, because I want to be thinking of your questions. We will get to the audience in a minute.
Just a slight small disagreement with Arvind in one respect. It's true that China is unique, but it's still, there are lessons that can be generalized. I repeat the point about competition, about having one thing that characterizes China, like other Asians, like the case of South Korea and so on, is that you have to compete. You have to you cannot rely simply on the umbrella provided by policies. That has been an important difference. And see, 3 examples of success in Brazil. They are all related to that. Think of Embraer. Embraer is what it is because it can operate at the core of a global value chain in which it explores its capacity to design planes, to fabricate the planes. But the planes produced by Embraer, the engines come from France, semiconductors from Asia, and so on. So it operates and it has to compete, right? It's not protected. Compare this with the automobile industry, Brazil, or all the others import substitution based. Same thing about oil, Petrobras. Petrobras at a certain moment, before being submitted to several orders to buy local and so on, was competitive to Norwegians, to all the guys. No one could beat. And that was because Petrobras focused on its inner major capacity to do research and to exploit oil in deep sea and so on, but had to compete, and including. So, and the same thing applies to, they all have a component of science, local science based. That's the case of Embraer at the beginning, Petrobras and so on, agriculture. Mm-hmm. But the point that I want to make, agriculture, of course, the science-based agriculture and so on, but the point that I want to make is the role to be played by competition.
Yeah. Well, it goes back
in
to
China. That's the case of China.
It goes back to Laura's point about collaboration across countries. If you're, and also the point about what is your revealed comparative advantage. Your comparative advantage can be very significantly affected by decisions by other countries and value chains. So, and hopefully there will be enough preservation of these multilateral trading system to allow these value chains to be constructed.
Nancy, I want to ask Arvind one quick question. It's not even a question, it's just the Tamil Nadu story. Would you just say a word about Tamil Nadu and what its relevance to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, so it is kind of an example where kind of it's related to what Tristan was saying, that India has been a country that has absolutely comprehensively failed in doing manufacturing, successful manufacturing. India's global market, export market share of unskilled exports is like 2%. Its share of the global unskilled labor force is probably 25%, So it's been a complete failure on manufacturing. However, in the last 4 or 5 years, one of the states, the state I work with and advise, has been able to take advantage of the China +1 opportunity to attract, certainly, it's attracted the electronic industry, the automotive industry, non-leather footwear. I mean, now Nike's, many of the suppliers to Nike are based in this, which actually is unskilled, labor intensive. So the question is, how did this happen in India? But the more puzzling question is, how did this happen in a state in India which has amongst the highest labor cost relative to everywhere else in India? Tamil Nadu is one of the richest states within India, and yet it managed to attract. And of course, it's a complicated answer, but I think that it's a combination of some things that Ottaviano emphasized, that it does have a pool of engineers, skilled engineers, and so on. It's had a tradition of manufacturing, but I think the China +1 opportunity took advantage really by, and this is, I mean, subsidies were a part of it, investment incentives were a part of it, but to me the big story was how did it manage to reduce, not how did it manage to increase the returns to investors, which every country tries to do by offering subsidies or protection, but how did it manage to reduce the long-term risks to investors? That, I think, is the Tamil Nadu story. How do you create an environment?
And you're not saying anything about cognitive skills,
No. So I said,
which distinguish Tamil Nadu.
no. So I said that's where the engineers come in, the pool of engineers come in.
But lower down too. Lower down too.
I mean, I think that to me,
Secondary education?
Yes, secondary education.
I mean,
Technical education.
I mean,
Level
Nancy, I'm sorry to disappoint you because,
You're not ever sorry to disappoint me.
if you look at the ASER learning outcomes in primary education.
But no, about Tamil Nadu.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. Tamil Nadu doesn't do that much better than most other states on the learning outcomes. And in fact, maybe to even contradict you to some extent, the Tamil Nadu success in terms of labor has been based on skilled engineers, which I think are important, tapping into the female labor force, and 3, tapping into migrant labor, unskilled migrant labor from other parts of the country.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do it a little differently than originally planned because I want to ensure that the audience has an opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to go to the audience. We're going to take 2 to 3 questions. Please keep your questions very short, but I want to preserve time at the very end to do a lightning round across everybody to say anything you want about the subject, particularly how the rules should change, if at all. Okay, so I have 1 question here, 1 question here, and 1 question here. And please, once again, short questions.
Hi, Chris McRae. A question for Nancy Birdsall and maybe Laura. My father's work at The Economist would echo very much what you said on East Asia, although I was wondering, village community health, women empowerment, I'm not sure if you mentioned that fully, and that was obviously, I think, the lesson from Bangladesh, which maybe the Clintons learned in 1992 when they went, because they visited Bangladesh before they became president. So sort of the community, women's health, how that was really important in all the tropical areas, because if you can't get life expectancy up from low 40s to mid 60s, then all the rest of development doesn't really work.
Okay, interesting. Health, the health issues and, okay, I think we're going to have to take 4 questions. We have this gentleman here, and we have this gentleman here, and I think we had this gentleman here. Okay, and we'll take those questions. So-
Hi, everyone. I work with Laura at OSF. My question is mostly to Tristan, with specific reference to African countries and the question of comparative advantage. I would like maybe to hear from you in terms of how do we prevent, because the risk is, again, African countries will be caught up and stuck in being raw material exporters, but only for critical minerals this time instead of the others.
Very good,
So-
okay.
so
Comparative advantage.
can you speak to the idea of a dynamic comparative advantage? Can a country actually shift its comparative advantage from one area to another area?
Okay, and I think this gentleman in the blue suit.
Thank you very much for wonderful insights. Adele Hamazia, Belfer Center, Harvard, and Highbridge Advisory. First question-ish is if you could just maybe speak to, were countries to comply with, say, OECD minimum tax rates, are we going to see more tax rate competition, or are we going to see more subsidies? Tristan had referred to high-risk sectors, I think was the term. For countries which are less democratic, how subjective would a sunset clause be for sectors that aren't working? At what point does one, what would be the strategies to get off the carousel for sectors which are maybe almost synonymous with the leadership, perhaps?
Okay. This gentleman right here with the dark red tie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Desmond. I'm a government advisor. I just want to ask Reid one question. From your perspective, what I hear from you is that you're really tackling, or your research or whatever project you're looking at is looking at intermediaries, which is legal. But then there's the role, especially in Africa, of intermeddlers, especially officious intermeddlers. And they are informing industrial ecology, and they're creating their own power and moving the markets. Is this included in what you look at in the future? Because this is what I'm struggling with right now as an advisor.
Okay, very good. Let's take those questions, and anybody who wants to comment should jump in. Tristan, you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I can talk about Africa. I mean, so there's static and comparative advantage. And you see, again, in the data, that comparative advantage is relatively slow moving. So it'll build, and the half-life is like 7 years. And then at any given decade, you have about half of the things you export are things that you exported a decade ago, and half are new, dynamic, that you've discovered. So I think a government should think about both of those things, understanding that the things you're already good at are important and a source of revenue, and then creating space for new things to grow. For Africa specifically, so I've done most of my work in Africa. I lived in Nigeria for a while. I'll say one thing. Commodities are not terrible if you manage them well. Chile became a high-income country, basically exporting copper. Saudi Arabia is doing very well. Part of the aspects of that, if they've been able to find a way to redistribute the wealth and create a middle class that can demand things. Obviously, that's not something that has happened in Nigeria as well, but it's, I think, not something to, if you manage the resources right, you can go away, and you don't need, Norway, all they do is oil, but they're very rich, and they eat in each other's restaurants all day. That's their life. For dynamic things, I think Africa, I think, struggles because it doesn't often have these market access thing. AGOA, was taken away from Ethiopia. It's at risk generally. Only a few countries exploited that anyway. I think digital services, computer programming, entertainment, design, these sorts of things that individuals can contribute to without a lot of infrastructure. Actually, Colombia is a major exporter of music production services to the United States. I don't think there are tariffs on that. I'm sure Nigeria can do some of that. don't know if you're from Nigeria, I'm just speaking to my own experience. I think maybe we'll talk offline. I'm not sure what you mean by intermeddlers, but yeah.
Okay, actually, what we can do now, since we're short of time, is why don't we go through all the panelists and answer any of these questions that you're interested in, and also say anything and make any final comments.
Are we doing in order? Okay.
Yes.
So one quick comment to address a question that I think connects to the discussion we were having earlier. I think the way I was giving examples of specific sectors in specific countries and the way we can pick winners doesn't imply in picking the entire supply chain of something, right? It's about finding your piece. And I think that connects to what Tristan was saying in terms of not taking the whole thing. And there's a case of industrial policy in Brazil that has been used to show the failure of industrial policy, which is the ship industry. So Brazil did a policy for the ship industry. And I would say that the main mistake there was not that to use industrial policy tools, it was that it tried to integrate the entire supply chain of ships. And actually, if it had done only a piece of it, it would have much higher chances of success. So that's, I think, one piece that connects to, and I think one implication is that of the trade agreements, integration, cooperation between countries, not only to gain scale, but also as a way to enter new pieces of the supply chain and sort of explore those complementarities and technological endowment complementarities. In terms of the rules-based system, just to try to answer that, and I think we're, of course, living through a crisis of that system. Double standards are perceived everywhere, which also demotivates countries, especially in the South, of even engaging in some of the climate action and other things that we would want to see. But there's also, I would say, an opportunity for cooperation and for Global South leadership in those spaces to reform it. One aspect that I think hasn't been mentioned enough is, and there I'll move to the climate negotiations, is that there's a lot about finance, and even the discussion about just transition has always been about who are the losers or the losing sectors or the workers that are going to lose, and how do we compensate for some of that. And that's, of course, crucial and important. I don't want to reduce that the relevance of the discussion, and maybe that's where we're going to face struggle a lot in this new geopolitical context, because finance has not been moving the way it should. But there's a different set of questions that relate to trade and industrial policy and the discussions we're having here. And so climate, the just transition shouldn't only be about the losing parts. It should also be about the potential winners and how those countries in the north or China are benefiting economically from the climate transition. There are many new sectors that are thriving, jobs that are being created, and for the South there isn't much. And that strengthens the kind of political barrier of countries seeing a trade-off between development and climate and not engaging in that agenda. And so if the multilateral system was one that allowed or made it easier for countries to seize those opportunities and find those pieces of the supply chain through technology transfers, different IPR regimes, and other trade agreements and cooperation, and a rules-based system that allowed for industrial policy tools to be used in that sense, I think it would find a way around the current kind of stagnant environment in climate negotiations. And so that's one piece that I think we can make a lot of progress, and that the US wasn't having a very important role, not to even say a negative role, in the past decade. And so that's where maybe the US withdrawal can actually open up some room for others to take leadership, especially in a year where we have South Africa leading, as president of the G20, Brazil with COP, BRICS, etc. We would hope that this leadership will move forward some of these agendas.
Yeah, very interesting point. Nancy.
So I just want to comment on what I've heard and learned and thought about because of the panel. What's so interesting about the World Bank study 30 years ago is complete dismissal of the possibility that other governments in developing countries could do the same job in terms of promoting exports or promoting shared growth, but certainly if you mentioned industrial policy, it was no, not possible. And 30 years have gone by, and this discussion is a reminder that there's been a tremendous improvement in governance. We don't know how to measure it, we don't know how to think about it, but it's there. And I thought about that a lot when I was reading this, for the second time after 30 years, that it's a different world. And the panelists are all talking about strategies and so on in countries. So it goes back to the question about Bangladesh and the village community health workers. I mean, Bangladesh is such an interesting example of incredible success on social progress and success as in textiles and apparel because of women workers. And so something's been going on despite sort of almost chaotic changes in leadership from one bad government to another bad government. At the lower level, there are just a lot of people in Bangladesh that know how to run things. And that's happening in Africa as well. So it's such a different world. It's very encouraging to hear this conversation for me, frankly. Also, the G20. I mean, the relevance of the G20 compared to the G7 on economic issues is so obvious now. We don't really, people who work in development go to worry about the G20, what's going to be on their agenda, who will be leading it, what sort of steps might be taken by the MICs, the middle-income countries. And the same with China. I mean, there's a kind of the fear of China that existed 30 years ago that in a weird way inspired a lot of what was shared growth in the smaller East Asian economies. There's still that fear of China, but China has also made huge contributions and opened up a lot of space. So, this whole conversation makes me feel more optimistic about the future than one feels reading about President Trump's tariff war.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, very quickly, Arvin and Fabiana.
I have nothing to add.
Okay.
If I may, I would like to piggyback on one point made by Tristan on copper and Chile. When I was at the World Bank, I used to call it a hummingbird because besides the money that the World Bank can provide, it also can pollinize knowledge by learning successes and failures from here and there. Conditional cash transfers is a good example, and so on. And one experience that I was very fond of is that during the time I was vice president, we put together to learn Chile and Mongolia. Chile and Mongolia? Yes, what did they have in common? Copper. And we brought in parliamentarians and people from the government of Mongolia to learn about the successful model established in Chile that pays attention to the macroeconomic stability because they have, the committee that established whether the price of copper is above or below the tendency, and then there are fiscal rules that command the saving apart or allowing for the expenditure. And the macroeconomic management of Chile has helped it to get where it got, right? And and we brought people from Mongolia. Mongolia adapted. I will not open my mouth to say whether it did it successfully or not because I lost track. But the point to make is about the learning, and that leads me to the answer, my proposed answer to the question the guy made. There is a homework that cannot be done by anybody else out. Let me give another example, and then I finish. I went to a mission to Brazil, accompanying the president of the bank, and while we were there, we were taken to a small land grab, very successful producer of sugarcane, and then the owner and manager, an agricultural engineer, turns on the laptop to me and to the president and shows 18 spots on his small grab of land. And then he says, these are 18 different types of seeds that I choose from the 500 plus different types of seeds that the system provides to me. So there was human capital, the guy, but the availability of different seeds so that the guy could use the laptop in order to cherry pick the seeds.
Technology.
Yeah, technology.
I'm sorry.
And then the president of the bank turns to me, smiles, that's science. Yeah, and the point is that at a certain moment, that knowledge was made available to African countries through, and that's a meritful initiative taken by Lula back in the 2010s, which was to create an office in Ghana, in Accra, in order to make available, which, you know, with some minimum additional work, those seeds can be used, adapted to soils in Africa. Guess what was the interest by the countries? Not much. The problem is that
I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. We're 10 minutes over time. So
a homework that has to be done by the countries, okay?
all right. Well, this was a really interesting discussion. It's obviously timely. Tristan mentioned that 80% of clients want to talk about these policies. Very clear from this discussion, the multilateral trading system remains key. I really like Laura's point that some of the big southern countries can start to take leadership along with Europe and others who are forming a new coalition of willing to keep it going during this, I would say, detour on the part of the United States, which I hope is ultimately reversed. So thank you all for participating. Thanks to our panelists and thanks to